I wrote a book not that long ago called AI and UX, and it's context, interaction, and trust. That's what we've discussed here. People are revealing things. That is the context. How you interact, that's going to be a lot that goes into whether I see this as good or bad or successful, but it's all building towards trust. And if we have that mindset of MVP, let's just get it out there and see what happens, that trust will not be assured.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Awkward Silences. Today we're here with not one, not two, but three guests. Very exciting. We've got Larry Becker, director at Bold Insight. We've got Gavin Liu, managing partner at Bold Insight. And we also have Katie Johnson, global head of research at Panasonic Well. So excited to have you all here today. We're going to talk about prototyping AI experiences within live research. Maybe to get started, could you tell us a little, how do you know each other? How do you work together?
Many, many years ago, and right before Web 2.0, I was running e-commerce for a large consumer electronics company, and they brought a consultant in to teach us about something called user experience and usability. So it's the late 90s, early aughts. So I was the VP. Gavin was that consultant. And I learned so much in that engagement. Gavin and I, our careers evolved. We did different things. And then about 5 years ago, I read a book that had great impact on me. And it was a book by someone you may have had on this podcast, Indy Young. And Indy was talking about practical empathy and the kind of empathy researchers need, distinguishing affective empathy from cognitive empathy. At the time, I was freelancing and I had great clients, but many of them were from retail. And retail folks, out of necessity, they can be really transactional. So I would be like, hey, let's talk about empathy. And they'd be like, hey, can't we just do free shipping again? So I knew I needed to talk to somebody. So I called up Gavin and we reconnected. And I joined his team, and my very first client was Katie Johnson. And we started prototyping experiences from day one. So that's my origin story for this trio, but I welcome other perspectives on that.
Can anyone corroborate this story?
It happened about 25 years ago. So I will say that it is a truth.
I was 7, Gavin was 5.
Exactly, we're little kids.
We all were.
So, I started a company way back in the 90s called User-Centric. The concept of UX wasn't really a thing. It was more usability, maybe. It was more human factors. And, along that way, I sold the company to a big market research firm. So I learned a little bit about market research, what goes into a business case for new features. And then we started Bold Insight, which is really primarily a research team. So we took away the UX design part. We said, there's a lot of product teams that have that in-house. How do we really focus on understanding what are the real problem statements? How do we explore those areas? How do we do formative research to make the thing that they want better and hit the mark? And along the way, Katie Johnson called us up when she was working at a really big company and said, I have a really strange question to ask. And it's all about how people can adopt new technology that doesn't yet exist. And what are the different research techniques to do so? And with that, I'll pass to Katie.
Yeah, from my point of view, so, I'm a little bit younger than both of these guys. So 25 years ago, I was not there, just a little bit. And, but yeah, you have to picture from my point of view. So I also come from a human factors. I'm technically actually a dual degreed engineer that's been masquerading around as a consumer insights kid for the last 15 years. But in 2020, I found myself at a really weird kind of moment in time, as many of us did right back then. I was a new mom. I was a month into working at Google, which was wild, at what felt like, the pinnacle of my career. And I realized that I needed some serious help. We were building 0 to 1 products on the Assistant. And Google, of course, had pre-vetted vendors, right? So you couldn't talk to anyone that wasn't vetted already at Google, which is great. I mean, they have absolutely world-class vendors that they deal with. But of course, like every person that hires a vendor has their own style, right? So I interviewed 3, and I hadn't worked at Google before, so I wanted to make sure I was doing a really good job. And I interviewed 3 different vendors. And the interview process that I put together was long. I think we did like 3 or 4 rounds of interviews with each of the 3. And Gavin and I it was like finding someone that spoke your language. Like I needed someone who appreciated engineering the way that I do, as effectively at this point a rookie engineer, someone who appreciates product strategy the way that I do, and someone who appreciates, users the way that I do. And so meeting Gavin was really like, this is it. And so I bid adieu to the other 2 vendors and hired Gavin and immediately met Larry. And Larry has been my, he hates the word coworker, my colleague effectively for not having worked at the same company. He's been my colleague for the last 5 years at 2 companies. We have been the closest collaborators of anyone I have the privilege of working with. So it's been a really wonderful ride to get to work with Gavin and Larry, specifically Larry, in the trenches at 2 different companies over the last 5 years.
Well, this is wonderful. I'm so glad I asked. So that's a lot of great background for everybody as we get into the nuts and bolts of this conversation, on who we're talking to and how you all know each other and have for a long time. So, all right, let's jump into things. All right, so you talk about bringing a prototype the experience mindset to your research. What do you mean by that? And why is it important for AI experiences in particular?
I'll take a crack at the first part. So as the recovering marketing and e-commerce VP, I don't mind being very on the nose at first. And nothing against marketing VPs, by the way. I haven't been one. If you think about, like, from a business standpoint, how do you justify an investment in UX research? Why would you do that anyway? For me, I have always thought about it as, well, I want to reduce risk in whatever I'm building, and I want to surface opportunities in whatever I'm building, and I want to do so as cost effectively as possible when I was on the in-house client side. So, in cases where the technology will be built later, in cases where the app is still under development, you start sort of stepping backwards into more of a lo-fi mindset. And in early days, like, again, back when Gavin and I were 5 and 7, you would do paper prototyping, right? Because you were prototyping screens. And as the surfaces that we're interested in have evolved, just sure, paper prototyping is probably archaic in some ways, but that mindset of what is the level of fidelity at which I can get maximum ROI on my research efforts move towards lower. And it's not just an app screen. It's not just, the controls on a phone or a smart home device. There are experiences that are being imagined that we're going to have and have begun having with AIs, with LLMs that are increasingly part of how we get things done and how we talk to each other. So really, on one level, and Katie is much more articulate about this part than I am, so I'm going to pass her in a minute. What we've been doing for like 5 years in different settings is really creating these experiences with various degrees of simulation and real product and always real participants to understand how do you optimize an experience ideally before the most costly resources are deployed.
I think that we're living in a very, I'll use not the official term, but experiment and find out season of life. There are other phrases that folks use when they talk about that, right? But we're living in a season of life where there's a lot of ability to just try things, right? Which is really exciting. Back to paper prototyping, I think vibe coding and coding with LLMs really democratizes access to the ability to build things that, is really, really exciting. Even for folks like me who, know or learned a long time ago how to code and are very, very bad at it, it's a beautiful time to be alive because you don't have to debug as much as you had to back then, right? And I think that yields kind of a desire to just say, oh, ship it and let's just see what happens. And at the same time, what's happening when we say that is we're living in a world that is no longer the world that we live in when we say that. We grew up, all 4 of us grew up in a world where product development was all about building deterministic products. It was about pushing pixels, and those pixels were going to be the same when Erin opened the app and when Gavin opened the app and when Larry opened the app and when Katie opened the app. And so the principles, the heuristics of product design, and specifically in UX research usability, come from a world in which we know exactly what we're building and we can control it. And the reality is now we live in a world where we have ceded control. And in a way that's very scary and in a way that's very exciting, because now not only is the app that Katie opens different from the app that Gavin opens because Gavin and Katie are using it differently, but the app Katie opens today and the app Katie opens tomorrow aren't the same app either, because that app knows me differently tomorrow than it did today, right? And so we're living in a world where, although we don't do paper prototyping as Larry suggests anymore, we really are doing paper prototyping in simulation that is going to give us the answers about what stochastic product experiences feel like to folks over time, which is a completely new discipline. And we are at the dawn of being able to invent a new discipline to build products and understand, more importantly, how people actually use those products over time. So it's a really exciting time for the discipline if we are willing to shed the orthodoxies of deterministic product development that no longer serve us, which I think this team really, really is.
And I would add, it's what Katie's just described is, it's not the .com era that Larry talked about, Web 2.0 or Web 1.0. It's not about doing that MVP just to get acquisition and numbers. What Katie's referring to is a technology that's evolving rapidly, but they're dealing with humans and people. So if I ask it to do something and it says, sorry, I don't know how to do that, I'm never going to ask again, even though it may figure it out over time. So that first impression, when we think about, oh, let's just get it out there and have MVP, you can completely destroy the market and you can have a lot of negative impact. I mean, just think about Siri, how that really was wonderful, but how many people use Siri today? But what's more scary is how many people use Cortana from Microsoft or Bixby from Samsung. The experience that people have on new technologies, when it doesn't always work the way you expect it, yet it evolves, can actually really ruin the situation for other companies that may have incredible technologies. And so that's where prototyping is really important, not just to see if it works, if it's something you can comprehend, but can you anticipate those problem statements so you can actually have a product that's differentiated?
I think that's right. And you guys are making me think of another dimension particular to the work that Katie and I have focused on in the last couple of years. So everything, that Gavin just talked about, the stakes of early interaction. Certainly, Katie and I saw that when we were working together on her work at Google. And, it was assistant. So, you're going to ask this thing to help you get things done. And if it doesn't understand or if it screws it up, probably not going to ask it again. However, all these things about, stochastic, deterministic versus non-deterministic products that Katie was describing so beautifully, when the stakes are, as it has been in our recent work, wellness. And forget, the Gwyneth Paltrow sort of neon opacity that word may have, but really, like, Erin, how are you feeling? How is your last couple of weeks been? What's a highlight? What's a low light? How's work, family balance, integration? Those are the questions that Katie and I have been asking families literally now for years. And go back to Gavin's point about one false move. Yeah, they might not engage with the product anymore, but when the stakes are emotional well-being and maybe even physical well-being, there's even more of an incentive to get it right, which is why we labor so much over method design. And like if Katie and I described to you the method we used, most recently, on one level, it sounds like, oh, you guys had a couple of Dixie cups and a piece of string, because it is kind of lo-fi, but it is very, very carefully thought out to yield maximum insight while protecting human subjects. And that, the spoiler alert, is what we are going to talk about, or perhaps when this is aired, already spoke about at Epic. at the Epic conference, and we've all collaborated on a paper about this particular work, especially as Katie described it.
You've all hit on so many sort of like dualities, paradoxes that I think about a lot when I think about AI, right? So like, for example, bringing it back to basics with the paper prototype, even as this technology is becoming more advanced and less deterministic all the time, right? That like some of those sort of first principles of humans and basic prototypes are more relevant than other. That as this technology moves faster and faster and faster, getting it right the first time is more and more important, right? You can't just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. These human customers are going to make an impression, and you want it to be a really good one, right? Because there's this arms race of AI happening, and that's important. So lots of good insights to get us kicked off here. I think it'd be fun to dig into some examples. So you're bringing the lo-fi prototype mental model into a lot of your current research, I know. Where would you like to jump in? What stories do you want to tell first?
Do you want to go into history, or do you want to move forward in the DeLorean, or do you want to move back?
Is it 1955 or is it?
No.
Yes.
Hey, we're not that old. But even Gavin are.
Yeah, I don't remember what year it is. Yeah.
I feel like this is very.
We can do both. We can take us through time. Yeah.
You want to tell the Verizon story?
Sure, I'll take you through time.
The accessibility story is very relevant here.
Yeah. So back when I met Larry, or probably a few years after that, we were working with Verizon Wireless. And for those who are listening, this has all been published. There was a lawsuit against Verizon Wireless because a blind woman named Bonnie O'Day sued and said, you don't have a phone that really works for blind people. And of course, Verizon went to court and said, but we don't make phones. She won the lawsuit because the jury felt that if Verizon really wanted to make a phone, manufacturers would. So we'd been working with Verizon on lots of different products, both in-store, on-device, instructions, all these kind of things. And the sponsors asked me to do a lot of research. We ended up doing a program of research with over 200 people who are blind and low vision to understand how to create an experience that didn't yet exist for voice only. But one of their challenges, and think about what we're talking about today, AI. Well, back in this period, it was speaker recognition, which is a precursor to a lot of things we were talking about. And that is the engine itself may make mistakes. We're testing whether or not somebody can go through the product flows, the call flows. Add John to your phone book, for example. How do you do that without using the screen, but only voice? So we actually would do kind of a Wizard of Oz where researchers had a prototype, which they'd press buttons based on what the participant said. And if they would say, please say a command, and the person would say, call John. And then they would press the right buttons and it would speak back out. So we had a Wizard of Oz prototype, but the goal was the human controlling it was the speaker recognition engine. We wanted to take that out of the loop because if people get confused because it didn't recognize, we don't know if it's because of the engine or if it was the call flow. So at the end of all this research, we did things where we could even see participants kind of cover themselves up because there was something that we created like a siren, all these real environmental cues, and to see how they would respond to it. At the end of about a year after the research was done, I was asked to represent it. So I did all the program of research. I flew out to DC and I said, oh, over lunch, who am I speaking to? And they said, oh, it's just going to be you, myself, the president of the American Foundation for the Blind, and Bonnie O'Day herself. At the end of the talk, my sponsor handed a phone to Bonnie, and she said, why don't you add someone to your phone book? And at the end of that 30-second exercise, the phone said contact saved. And Bonnie handed the phone back and said, and this is why I sued you. And that it took less than a year to build that experience. And for me, it was all about a prototype, rapidly understanding what are the things that people would say, not see and press, because it's a whole new world. And think about how open AI has become as a new world. There are ways to prototype, which as part of the Epic talk, we're going to really talk about different ways we can insert prototyping into an AI world to understand what would the human interaction be? And are we helping to shape that design in a way that actually improves success? Or is it about confusion?
Yeah, and I'm so glad we actually went back, because now we're gonna go forward. But at the time, and even just listening to it now, I don't always think about research as being innovative, and that here we are with what is the right prototype for this experience when this doesn't exist yet. And that's never been more true than, of course, it is right now, as you think about what's the right prototype for an experience that doesn't exist yet for these AI experiences. So yeah, that's great. Well, where should we go now? Where should we go in the future? Or the
Maybe.
present?
Here's the press. I think, Katie, what to me is really interesting, and I was kind of like eyes wide watching this a few weeks ago as we were doing it. Think about the study we wrote, the epic paper about from last summer, and the nature of the simulation, then the nature of the human role playing and the use of AI to feed the human role playing. And then if you take it into a few weeks ago where you like IM'd me on the side and you're like, oh my God, are we doing multiplayer? Are we doing multiplayer LLM here? We decided. So I think that is an interesting nugget methodologically in how we got there.
Yeah, I think there's only so much of that we can really talk about here, but we can definitely allude to some of that stuff for sure. So yeah, I think to me, one of the things that I keep revisiting is that we are at the dawn of a new era when it comes to how these things evolve over time and how people feel about them, right? I mean, that's why you're seeing so many articles pop up like minute by minute in the Times of people like having experiences that are either causing them to, you know, feel really alone or act on feeling really alone. Like we're seeing consequences of personal use of these kinds of bots. We are just scratching the surface, right? I mean, when people are using it to write their emails or things like that, it's a lot less risk. When you're using it for personal use cases, stuff changes. And a lot of the work and domain that Larry and I have spent our time in is in wellness and families and personal use cases, right? So like we are talking about putting a bot right in the middle of the melee of family life, right? Which is nuts, as we know. It's nuts. There's a lot going on. And so I think one of the things that we are acutely aware of in the work that we're doing is the fact that even though we could literally publish things and put them in the hands of users and just step away, and in some cases we do that, really the thing that we really want to unpack, and to Gavin's point about the Verizon story, is where are we designing the experiment to give us the dependent variables that we're looking for, right? Like we're designing experiments with independent and dependent variables. And the nature of stochastic products means there's a lot more independent variables than there were in the past. And so where can we make those variables dependent, or at least kind of dampen the effects of the independent variables so that we can get really strong signal still to this day on the dependent variables that we're actually testing. So one example that Larry kind of was talking about there, alluding to before, is that we know that people build relationships with LLM products. We know it. I mean, it's just a fact, and you can see it in these articles. Whether or not we want to talk about it as a society or deal with it yet is a completely different question, but we know that there are relationships there. And we know that relationships are formed really, they can be formed instantly or tanked instantly. And so there's moments like that, or independent variables like that are worth examining and thinking about, okay, we definitely want to preserve the stochastic nature of a model and the randomness and the excitement of interacting with this novel technology, but we don't want to take the risk of it saying something inappropriate that would tank a budding relationship, particularly with multiple people, right? Because if you think building a relationship with one person at a time is hard, imagine building it with multiple people. And now imagine building it with multiple people who are in relationship with each other. And you are the interloper as the LLM coming in, right, to a family that has established behavior patterns. And so the nature of introducing a new novel technology that's meant to help into a rat's nest of like evolved family mechanics is already messy. And if that thing if Larry and I are partners and raising kids together and we have some deep-seated issues, and all of a sudden imagine the LLM takes my side in something, we have a problem, right? So even in the work where we could ship something and give it to people and study that behavioral data without the context of navigating the nuances of those relationships, we're not really understanding how LLMs should not only show up, but learn from the family, observe, and show up over time. In a way, the LLMs have to be almost as sensitive as we researchers are when we are running interviews, right? And navigating the complex dynamics of a family. And so, in the world where we were simulating that a year ago, we were managing kind of ongoing relationships with LLMs that are existing and out in the public sphere. So, in other words, we are building a relationship between a family and, say, GPT. Okay. And we are managing and shuttling the responses back and forth as simulators of what GPT spits out for that family and then what the family actually sees. And that helps us curate exactly what we want to go over the wire to the family. Now, a brief aside about that part of the story is that what was so incredible to me in that study is that when we switched out the researcher who was shuttling the responses back and forth, they noticed. Like, the families noticed. They said things like, "Who broke the LLM?" Something changed. They noticed. And we're talking about copy paste and curate a handful of text, right? And people noticed. So this is how sensitive relationship building is. And it is wildly sensitive. So, and Larry and I have seen that before in other experiments that we've done. People anticipate that we had made changes to the model when we didn't, and they missed it when we did. So, like, there's just so much going on, and there's sensitivity in the human brain to detect these things, but it's not always one to one, right? So we're dealing with that. In the year since we did that experiment that we're going to talk about at Epic, literally the tools themselves have evolved such that they can now take in multiple comments from multiple people at once and discern who's speaking and spit something out that's much more holistic as a response. Like, the actual tools themselves have evolved, and therefore the nature of our simulation has evolved. And when I say that the tools have evolved, no one is saying that. We found that out because we literally experimented on the fly in a session to see if we could make it more effective, lower latency as a session, and literally discovered that the tools had evolved enough to support this new design of experiments that we were running this year. So even our experimentation method isn't rigid at all. Like, in fact, we have to consistently experiment on our own experiment to make sure that we are being thoughtful about the best, most effective way to tweak those independent variables in the most precise, meaningful way that we can, given where the technology is today. It's a wild time to be conducting experiments, for sure.
My guess is after that, like for me, I bet like a lot of listeners like me are going, wow. Some might be saying, what? So just to decode just some of that, respectfully, and I think we can talk about this because this is in the published paper, right? That what we're talking about in Helsinki. The method, when Katie talks about the researchers sort of acting as this filter for what we're pulling from the existing LLMs, from GPT or whatever, and then interacting with the family, the participants who are consented, of course, and everything, they believe that they are interacting with a prototype product. Let's say the prototype product is named, Coffee Cup or whatever. So, Coffee Cup is my LLM, but really what it is it's someone like me or Katie or Gavin, supported by three people hitting, GPT and everything else, crafting responses. And this is where it gets interesting year to year, we're kind of, as human researchers, going, oh, I get this family's vibe. I've been spending some time with them. So I'm going to take this GPT response and I'm going to add, my own emotional intelligence and my read of the room and filter that through. The other variable that's sort of interesting, this is a lot of the work that Katie and I did at both companies. We've always done stuff, and this is Katie's advocacy, sort of to save our race from the dark AI overlords. That Katie has always maintained that, humans are going to continue to add value, Larry, and not just so you and I can have jobs, but this is real. We have a stake in it. You need a human in the loop when you discover the edge of the AI technology's competency. So one of the experiments that we did last year that we were was like, well, what kind of human? So then we had other humans come in and are they playing the role of an empathic empathic peer, or are they a credentialed expert? Do we want the human in the loop help to be proactively sought? Should it be introduced? So those are some of the variables that Katie was alluding to, as independent. And now, this past year, I think what we started to see is that when we were conducting these multiplayer conversations with the family members, parents, teens, whatever, and we were managing conversations with the technology, we were just getting the whiff of that the technology was starting, the LLMs were starting to keep up. Like, let's say the four of us were a family, or you, the three of you were a family, and I'm channeling in responses going back and forth. GPT or whatnot seems to know, oh, well, tell Erin this, tell Gavin this, and tell Katie that. And we're, what? Cool, you can do that. So it's been an amazing, moment to moment discovery experience.
Well, and just to build on one last thing that you said, Erin,
Mhm.
earlier, you talked about the idea that like sometimes research gets this kind of reputation of being a little bit like reactive or like let's just observe and quietly study and like take copious notes. And I mean, we are literally with research sitting on the cutting edge of product design because we are studying the future right now, and in so doing are literally inventing the products that need to be there. And not only the products, but even just like interaction paradigms. And it's such a cool time for the practice. And I think there are a lot of researchers who feel very scared, and not just researchers, people in general who are very scared of this technology coming for our jobs, right? And the reality is we all have to be curious enough to imagine that there's a version of our job that lives beyond the world in which these junior LLM bots that are junior researchers or junior accountants or junior recruiters or whatever are doing some of these more menial tasks, right? Like and it's just there's so much to every one of our jobs that's actually so creative and acquired expertise and lived experience and all of these beautiful things that will continue to be very, very human. And in fact, more of what I do now is human than what I was doing 2 years ago, 5 years ago. And so it's really exciting if you can be curious about your job changing and have a growth mindset. I think it's a really cool time to kind of think about the practice actually being much more involved in product design, product development than it has been in the past.
Absolutely. I keep having this macro question as you talk, and tell me if this is something you've thought about, but you were talking about this a bit before too, Gavin, of is this experience I'm interacting with human or is it technology? Does it have a name? Is the name Coffee Cup or is it Larry? I don't know. Is this something you all have thought about, observed? Is that changing as obviously the technology is changing, but so is our relationship to it? Yeah.
I think one of the earliest things, when Katie and I first started, and Gavin deserves some credit here, because in classic Gavin style, like after he hired me, he'd be like, okay, you're going to do this thing with Katie, and, I think it might just be that you design it. It's like one of those like guys like this, like they say, Duke Ellington could lead an orchestra, like raising one finger. That's how like Gavin and one of our other colleagues, Andres, will sometimes like say one sentence to me, and I'm like, oh, well, now I can write a 10-page discussion about it. Thank you for that. So what Gavin sent me to discover was he said, they're not going to know when you do this Wizard of Oz thing whether they're interacting with a human or a bot. And that's one of Katie's research questions. So see what happens. And that was like a year before, the Thanksgiving of ChatGPT and everything. So it was fascinating. People would be convinced it was a bot for all these reasons, or convinced it was a human for all these reasons. So that just something in response to, I think, was part of your question.
I think we have to watch out for which one's winning. Like there's a lot of news and it's honestly competition, it's market dynamics. People don't care. People want, as you talk and as things evolve to be more agentic, does it do what I want it to do? Utility, we talk about the invisible computer. My God, this thing in a perfect world would be invisible, but it would be good enough so that it doesn't matter what engine is behind it. What nobody really cares about how much CPU it costs or what have you, or what the token limit might be, because the reality is what gets output is what's consumed. And we know the output, it's got incredible grammar, It's evolved to incredible style and personality. And in all honesty, even when it has reached a token limit, you wouldn't know because it gives an output that is so strong. You believe it to be true, even if it's at the fringe of its token limit. And it's kind of making a guess right now, but it doesn't, like a human, give you that I'm guessing. This is as important as it was from your first prompt. So I think people ultimately in the next 5 to 10 years, I really hope they don't care, because I don't want to be in a world where I go, which engine am I going to toggle to? Because this one is really good for these things, but it's not good for, I just don't think people are that aware. We're not engineers. We're kind of lazy, to be honest. And we just want it to work.
I mean, I think when you're talking about the technology, I agree with you. When you're talking about the edge case where they are going to want a human, I would say everything we have studied in the last 5 years would tell me that there is going to still be this wall where it's like, and we've seen it in like movies and, the future casting type movies, even something like Westworld, where, someone gets rejected from a job in Westworld and he says, I'm sorry to ask this, but are you human? And it's obviously not, right? Like, and I think there are still going to be, if it's when we get to the edge cases where a human does need to intervene or where someone feels like they're being lied to about being communicated with by a human, we're still going to see that betrayal, distrust, anger, frustration. I think to your point, Gavin, the beauty of where we will end up is a place where we can naturally move between the places where it is truly more efficient, more effective, more universally supportive to have a bot help you, and where you've reached the edge and you actually do need a person. I mean, if you're dealing with some kind of bank crisis and you're trapped in a doom loop with a bunch of robots that can't answer your question, you do really need a human, right? And getting the identification that is the problem, the appropriate triage and the escalation correct in something like call centers is going to be really, really important, because in the work that Larry and I have done, a lot of the times it's literally going to be faster, more effective, and more meaningful for folks to have a bot do it. And then there are those edge cases where if you pretend that you are a human telling me that you understand what it's like to check your mom into hospice and you're a bot, that's it. I'm out. I don't want anything to do with you ever again. You're not a human. You don't know what it's like to have a mom. You don't know what it's like to lose a parent, and I don't want to hear it from you. I want to hear it from another human. So like that part I think we're still going to see, but I agree the almost invisible machine is the end game that I think everyone is excited about, because the fact of the matter, and Larry and I have seen this at company after company and study after study, is that delegation sucks. And that people don't want to have to delegate. People don't want to have to delegate to humans either, right? Like they talk about that when people say like, why don't you hire an assistant or get a babysitter or get a house cleaner? And they're like, it just takes too much work to tell them how to do it, right? So like as we get to the point where we don't need as much delegation, the machine is going to be more effective, more efficient in most cases.
What's the paradigm for like past assistant? It's it's air. It's how are we getting AI assistance and help when it's omnipresent and not delegated?
I don't know. Is it going to be like, there's something on your skin to detect?
We don't know what the dominant UI is going to be, right? But
there's something in Katie's response to Gavin just now, made me think too. And I think the example you gave, Katie, alludes to it. Some of this is driven by, I see two, one is an axis of stakes, the level of stakes of the task at hand, and also domain, because as soon, and again, as soon as you get closer to anything involving someone's well-being, they're going to pay more attention to the texture of the interaction. If I'm purely in an assisted model, let's say lowercase a assistant, so we're not talking about anyone's product in particular, if we're in that, fulfillment means a lot. And we saw that a lot in our research. I don't really care. Can it do it or not? What, the bot can't pick up my dry cleaning? I am not interested, and things like that. But then with the work in the domain we're working in now, you see the nature of the interaction, the qualitative ability to hold a conversation more, that goes beyond the obsequious, or what's that word? Sycophantic. That's it. I was reading something about the sycophantic nature of AI, and it's true, but sycophancy might get you through some business card exchanges if that's what you're about, but it's not going to help you form, a real relationship with a family. So then I think we're also going to see how once, we're in a more relational, less transactional realm, there may be a little more forgiveness too for, the quality of the execution when people, healthfully or not, are really beginning to depend on the relationships they develop with these LLMs.
I think what we're all hearing about is not just an evolution of the technology, but just think about what we've just talked about. I've heard a lot of transactions, but if the ask and the impact is higher, then we start to get to the fringe cases. All of this is describing a vast ecosystem that is based on transactions that we talk about getting right in A Wizard of Oz. Getting those right, but it's not just because we get to check the box. We're building trust. And humans filter. We will filter what we think is going to make us more successful because we're kind of lazy. We're not going to ask something we don't think it can do because I can't get that 5 seconds back. So it's going to be gradual transactions that start to push the envelope, that build trust. And then as we're doing this while the technology underneath it is changing. And as you get closer to those fringe cases, how do we understand our own technology without assuming it? And that's research. That is understanding where those fringe boundaries are so that we can anticipate and then start to work with engineering to say, look what we're seeing here. These are the bad examples. These are really good examples that pushed and supported that transaction because it's all input output, but it's really not. It's really trust. I mean, I wrote a book not that long ago called AI and UX, and it's context, interaction, and trust. That's what we've discussed here. People are revealing things. That is the context. How you interact, that's going to be a lot that goes into whether I see this as good or bad or successful, but it's all building towards trust. And if we have that mindset of MVP, let's just get it out there and see what happens, that trust will not be assured. And I think it's a lot of money being spent that could be wasted when you might have been really close had you done research to understand those edge cases so you can build a better experience.
I think that's a great place to transition into maybe some practical advice for anyone listening. We've talked about, some specific stories and examples of lo-fi prototypes, but, sort of parting thoughts for folks looking to bring this concept of a lo-fi prototype, maybe new kinds of prototypes, to new technologies that don't exist yet. What's your best advice for how folks can think about that in their own work?
From my standpoint, I think it's just get curious about the data. I mean, if you're living in a world, let's assume you're living in a world, because most people are right now, where people are just like, let's just ship it and see what people do with it, right? I think getting curious, I can't tell you how much of my day is spent just getting curious about the data. Like, oh, why did we see such low engagement on this particular thing that happened on this day? Instead of saying like, oh, we had low engagement. That's it, right? It's getting curious about the data and then figuring out how to make the research fit that question. So in that case, if let's say you are in the world and you're shipping and you don't have time, investment, money to do like a big, true longitudinal study, which is of course how I would recommend doing this if you had infinite time and energy and money and buy-in and all these things. But like even in the world where you don't, and all you have is this data coming in that's curious, what you can do is intercepts. What you can do is really, surgical survey instruments. And like, you can do straw polls. You can get on the phone. Like, you can go get the chat logs and figure out how to get the chat logs with privacy consents and all those kinds of things, right? Like anonymization. so that you can actually start to unpack why people are doing the things that they're doing. In fact, I just had a meeting with some researchers this morning where we talk about like, okay, if you're looking at just the data, there's going to be some things that you can know, factually know. There's going to be a lot of stuff that becomes the new hypotheses around like, oh, why did people do that thing? It looks like all of these conversations about this topic end very quickly. Why? Why is that? It's weird, right? Like it could be because the LLM is not responding the right way. It could be because we have a transactional instead of relational model. It could be because we have too many people chatting in the same space, whatever. But these hypotheses then become ways for us to get really curious about how to do the quickest, dirtiest, 0 to 1 experiment to get in there and surgically try to justify, to understand. Larry and I, one other thing I'll just say before, I'm sure Larry will build on tons of this, but even as recently as 2 weeks ago, Larry and I were having a conversation about, the subjectivity of the practice. And I think we as researchers perhaps did ourselves a disservice all this time making all these comments about ourselves being objective witnesses and all this kind of stuff, right? There's a great deal of subjectivity in the practice. And in fact, that subjectivity is what makes it human. And it's what's going to endure is a lot of the subjectivity in the design of experiments, in the storytelling, and all these kinds of things. And so one thing Larry and I were even talking about 2 weeks ago was, as we design experiments, what's the most biased version of this experiment design that we could possibly write? Well, so we were writing a mod guide specifically for interviews, and we were writing the very, very biased versions of the questions, the most leading, obscene questions that anyone would ever write. And then we back that into like, how could we do this objectively or as objectively as possible, right? And so even just bringing subjectivity to the practice at all points for the purpose of designing the experiment in the most meaningful way in a world where we have too many independent variables, like let's get really surgical about what it is we're trying to learn so that we can design the experiment to be as precise as possible and get an answer that we can at least trust enough to design the next experiment.
Totally brilliant.
I'm
I
telling you,
love it.
I kind of want to
I'm
leave
just,
there.
there's a little train going, but brilliant mostly because it is surgical and every diagnosis has a different treatment plan. And let's be smart about it. It's too easy to fall prey to, hey, I want to know if it asks this prompt, does it get what I want? You can fall into that trap and be very transactional. But there are a couple techniques that Katie talked about that have a little bit of a longer tail, a little bit more of a relationship side. And suddenly you start to get that feedback where the participant says, wait a second. And that wait a second, that insight gives you signal that there's something deeper behind that one transaction, but taken as a whole, here's how they're thinking. Because remember, it's not just the technology. It's the people who are using it. They're also adapting and they're getting smarter. What are they thinking in the next order of thinking that you need to think about for your product? It won't only come with a couple really tried and true techniques. It may require a surgical targeting based on what your hypotheses are. And so I know Katie talks about dependent measures and all these things, but she's trying to make this world a lot more precise into this black box that is AI. And the more you can do that, the more assured you will be that this is the right direction. And it's not just transaction A, B, and C. It's where those participants start to see the trend that you might not be seeing because we're so focused.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And coming back to Erin's question of what techniques would we give people, I think what Katie described and what Gavin started to respond to, I think the real techniques are meta techniques. They are modes of critical thinking. Because when I was listening to Katie and thinking, yeah, that's what we do. And I came from an e-commerce and marketing background that was deeply influenced by early work I did with Gavin. I just made myself the user advocate in every organization I was in. But, the first CEO I ever worked for, said it's all about asking the right questions. And look what I ended up doing in my dream job, asking people questions. And what I heard in what Katie was saying is, you have to think about that laddering up and down with why and how, because product managers are going to bring you some very, very specific questions. Is that good? Well, it depends which questions. Because if they want to know all about a feature, I think a lot of researchers could do well with their best soft skills, practicing high diplomacy, to find out why that product manager wants to know about that feature, and that iterating why will get you to the root question. And Katie also talked about, precision of what you're looking for. To me, that's having very clear research objectives for every experiment. And Katie and I fight like crazy people about that on every project where we scope, like, what can we really learn here? But just agreeing, here's what we're trying to learn here, because the really deep and encompassing precision that Gavin was describing, that is arrived at incrementally, through asking, questions methodically and seeing where does it lead us next. The other thing that I heard in what Katie said is something that I learned from a book called The Inner Game of Music, like 35 years ago. It comes from the inner game of tennis. And Katie was talking about, how do we make the most subjective mod guide in the world so we know that's wrong? A lot of musicians, when they're performing, you're playing and you go, oh my, and Katie's a musician too. Don't let her, her lack of a backdrop bully. You think, oh my God, I really sound like crap tonight. Not productive, right? But if you go, okay, what's going on? Am I too loud? Am I too soft? Am I too sharp? Am I too flat? And just sort of breaking it down. And if you look at the complexity of the topics that were discussed, at least my little cheat sheet has been asking those very simple questions and working with people. You have to have a team that really you learn to trust, and that will let you do things. Because honestly, without blowing any smoke, the only reason that Bold Insight and that I and Katie have been able to do this work for 5 years is because Gavin has always created this environment for us. It's like, yeah, trust you guys. You guys are doing really interesting things here. And Katie and I have been able to do that for each other. So it may sound really kumbaya, but to do groundbreaking research or whatever it is we're talking about, you need that sense of community. I find it really important, and I think it's what's contributed to our success for the three of us.
I will add one last thing about working with Bold Insight from the client perspective is, one of the beautiful things about my job and the job that I get to play with Larry in our day to day is that although I really enjoy being a researcher, and I'm a good researcher, I'm a pretty good researcher, I would say. Like I get to watch Larry actually do research now, and I very rarely get to moderate anymore because he's so good at moderating. But the reality is that it allows me, and I think this is good advice for other researchers too, to step into the shoes of the product manager, right? Which is a really fun place to be without all of the heartache of actually taking that job in real life. But to be able to be thinking about designing the experiment to get the answer, to make the best decision we possibly can with the certainty level that we possibly can, and to be working with an agency in Bold Insight that, people ask me a lot, like, why do I go back to Bold Insight? And the answer is that I get to play the product manager because I believe that they will hold the line on the research for me, right? Like, if I push them to draw a conclusion that I want to draw, because we got to make a call, right? We got to make a call. We got to ship a change, and that's the job, right? I trust that Larry will let me walk right up to the edge of that conclusion, and if it is inaccurate or not substantiated, he will not let me do that. And it is a really beautiful place to be able to be a researcher and play the research game with Larry when I'm able to step into those shoes, and then 2 other days come back and like really fight to make a report like the one we're writing right now actually land and have actual impact in a world where everybody is looking for places to cut, right? Where research is delivering impact because I can step into the shoes of the product manager all the way up to our leadership. and Larry can hold the line on the integrity of the research, which is a really beautiful kind of game for us to play too.
I think the unintended theme of this episode has been trust, which is such a beautiful thing as we talk about AI and trust among you all, and the importance of trust between these technologies and the people, and how that's ultimately going to make it all successful. So that's been a fun surprise for me in all of this. So thank you all for joining. Where can folks find you online, or not online, or wherever you want to be found or not found?
Lots of places. Well, boldinsight.com, certainly for us. And we each have LinkedIn profiles under our individual names, of course. Katie, any other sort of channels for finding us?
I have been quitting everything online over the last, I'm only on LinkedIn. I used to be very active on like Twitter and Instagram, and I really just my motto for 2025 was no more notifications. So I deleted all notifications from my phone for 2025, which has been a huge freeing experience. So LinkedIn is the primary way to get a hold of me these days.
Get her at the right time, because she's not checking those notifications.
That's right. Honestly, it's been the single best gift I've ever given myself, because I'm one of those people that I'm an inbox zero kid, and the red dots on my phone were controlling my life. And so now there are no red dots on my phone, and the world hasn't collapsed. So it's been a really great gift.
But feel free to reach out. Put some more red dots on her little inbox. Because we're a bunch of geeks and we love talking about applying what we've learned into different areas. Have people reach out. Again, boldinsight.com, LinkedIn individually. Reach out. I'm sure we can have a really interesting conversation.
I think the email is hello@boldinsight.com, right? And they can just say, I heard Gavin, Larry, and Katie.
And they can see our team page and email us from there as well.
And
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. This is a lot of fun. Sorry we went 5 minutes over.